Okay. Anybody have any questions? We should easily get through the material today for exam 3, therefore exam 3 will be next Thursday. Okay, I will write it this weekend, put it together this weekend. Then I'll know we can review on Tuesday. But you should start studying now.
Yes.
Okay? So, last time, we were talking about coronavirus. And I gave you the idea that there is a mixing of the genes, and the mixing of the genes make the virus a novel virus. How is a novel virus communicated to people? Annalisa? How is so a novel means first time ever. How is a novel virus communicated to everybody? Guys?
I don't really understand the question.
So if we have, influenza A, but then we have a new influenza, how do we say it's a new influenza?
The N?
Huh?
Is it the N?
The N, correct. So if we put a little N in front of something like that, that means it's brand spanking new. We have never seen it before. Okay, you should know that. Okay? So, if we think about this for a moment, for a long time, we knew that the bat and the human and the pangolin were involved in the formation of the coronavirus. Right. Recently, in 2023, Wu and his colleagues published a paper saying that the raccoon dog was also involved. Right. And so, I didn't know anything about the raccoon dog. I thought my friends were playing a trick on me. They sent me an article. They wanted me to read it and get all excited, but I'm like, I don't even know what a raccoon dog is. So I thought they were lying to me, so I looked it up, and sure enough, that is a real thing. It's a canine. It's not a raccoon, but it belongs to the canine group. It's in Asia. And I looked up this paper to make sure that it was a valid, peer-reviewed article, and it was. And so then I got really excited. I'm like, oh my God. Because now we know that there's 4 organisms that were involved in the development of this SARS-CoV-2, which we know as COVID. Okay? And that was the human, the bat. The bat is always involved. The bat, the pangolin, which is kind of a cute little guy. Look at him, he's so cute. I'd like to have one, but no, they're against the law to have. And then number 4, the raccoon dog. And that's what made this thing so dangerous, is that immunologically we had not seen it before, and therefore we didn't have immunity to it. Okay? And so it's important to think about how these things work. So we know that phylogenetically, the pangolin, the bat, and the human have all been involved. And there were different hypotheses of how that could have happened, but now you have to throw the raccoon dog in there, right? And so now we know that it was a very complex virus. Mother Nature is very creative, and she is an assassin, right? And so it's important for us to think about. We believe that the initial infection area was the Wuhan district in China. But I will tell you that epidemiologists and physicians were reporting a fever of unknown origin at the same time it was happening in China. They were having a lot more cases in China, but we were seeing cases in Seattle, in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Chicago, and in New York.
So both East and West.
So what that means was people were going to China for business, and they were coming back, and they were bringing cooties with them. Are you with me? And then it was spreading. Right? And so that's an important thing to think about. We still believe that the origin happened in a wet market in China. And that still is the most plausible thing that could have happened, right? Because there was a mixing, all these organisms, the pangolin, the bat, and the raccoon dog were all there, right? They are sold on an open market, right? And so it's important for us to think about that. I think we said last time that the coronavirus has mutated how many times? Over 100,000 times, right? This is a dendrogram if you will. And really it's more of a histogram. Only up to April 2020, but this is how many times it had mutated already. And we don't hear about all of them. We only hear about the ones that are really dangerous, right? So we've heard of Omicron, right? We've heard of Delta. We've heard of Nimbus and Stratus, because they got all cloudy on me at one point. I'm like, what are you calling these things? Something Nimbus. That doesn't sound scary at all. Nobody's gonna be afraid of it. But the latest version of it is called cicada. And what's a cicada, Lisbeth? What's a cicada? You're gonna know it as a chicharra. What's a chicharra? The little insect that makes a lot of noise during the spring and the summer. The reason they call it the cicada is because it showed up in 2024, but it went dormant for almost a year and a half, and now it's back. So they're calling it the cicada because of that. Yes, Miss Sonia.
Is there any specific percentage that we need to know?
What do you mean percentage?
Like on how fast it spread?
No. If I ask anything about that, it's gonna be RO. Okay, and in that case, I would accept RO based on data, right? Because you've seen that. I would accept RO from anything from 1 to 3.4%. Okay? But other than that, there's no other percentage you'll need to know from me. Okay? So if you wanted to make that in the middle, 2%, I'm okay with that. Okay? So it does affect the different segments of age differently. So your age group, you're gonna kind of fall more in this area here. You all are not affected at all. You all will get it. It'll be a mild thing. Some of you might get a kind of a more serious form of it, but you'll come out the other end just fine. Right? But the older you get, right, then you can see the case fatality rates and the death rates, they go up. So somebody over 80 it's a 9% chance that anybody over 80 who gets coronavirus will die from it. Right? And we can look at that by country also, right? So you can see how different countries were affected. The older the populations were in it, right, the more likely that you had a lot of mortality, deaths associated with it. So, when I was in Ireland, the United States is about 250 years old, right? Some of those buildings in Ireland are older than any building that, if we put like 5 buildings and count up the years, some of those things were built in the 1600s, right? Some of those churches, all those places in England and Ireland, they were built a long time ago, right? And so it's pretty interesting to walk into one of those things that are now ruins, right? Nobody's doing anything with them, they're just there, they're historical landmarks. And you walk in there and you say, man, people were in the 1600s over here, right? And so it's pretty interesting to think about. Did we talk about this? So I'm not gonna talk about it again, but we'll go on. And then we talked about this, right? So people who have type A are more likely to have more serious complications with coronavirus than people who are type O. Type O is protected. That doesn't mean that type O people aren't gonna get really sick. That just means the likelihood, the probability that they're gonna get really sick is much lower. Okay? And then we talked about, let's talk about these a little bit. Paxlovid, Rengens, COVID, Remdesivir, and all the JAK inhibitors, and convalescent plasma. So these are all drugs here. The convalescent plasma is a little bit different. Let's talk about the drugs. Those had limited effectiveness. So of all the people who got really sick and we gave them Paxlovid, which was kind of the #1 antiviral that we would give them, it only helped about 50% of the population that took the drug, along with remdesivir. Right? Convalescent plasma, what is that? Harlow, what is convalescent plasma? Convalescent plasma is plasma from somebody who had the infection and got over it, but they have the immunoglobulins, antibodies in their serum, and they donate blood, and the people will then remove the serum from the blood the cells, they remove the plasma from the cells, and then they can inject that plasma into somebody who's got an active case of COVID. Because the immunoglobulins are in that plasma, then they can hopefully be benefited by the immunoglobulins, which will bind up the virus and hopefully not allow it to cause a lot of damage. It was only good in about 48% of the people who got convalescent plasma. So none of these things are perfect. Everybody's physiology and everybody's immunology is a little bit different. So what works in one person is not going to work in every single person. And that's important. The one thing that helped more than anything was a drug that we have had for a long time. And that is that one right there. Dexamethasone. Dexamethasone is a steroid. Why would a steroid, Jeanette Torres, why would a steroid help somebody who has a severe case of COVID? What do steroids do? Huh? They decrease inflammation. Yeah. So if your lungs are really inflamed and you're having trouble breathing and you take a steroid like Dexameth, then the inflammation will go down and your lungs will be a little bit more likely to function as much as possible. I mean, you still might have to put a chest tube in, and you might have to be on a ventilator, right? But it has a better outcome if we're using dexamethasone. Okay? Questions? And then we talked about El Chavo. So, and we talked about the vaccines, right? What are the two more effective vaccines? The Pfizer-BioNTech one, my favorite, and then Moderna. I would take that if there was nothing else. Right? I would take that if there's no Pfizer. Right? The only reason I'm not as happy about the Moderna one is because people complained of much more feeling sore when they got the injection. And I don't want to say, oh, it's going to be just fine, go get it. And then you're like, oh, it hurts so much. Then you're like, that probably lied to me. Right? So I want to tell you my experience. That doesn't mean that it's going to be like that for everybody. My brother called me when he was taking the vaccine and he said, they don't have the Pfizer one, they only have that Moderna one. And I said, well, take it. He said, but you said it wasn't as good. I'm like, I didn't say it wasn't as good. I said that it was my second favorite because people had a lot more soreness at the injection site. Right? That's what I said. So he took it and he complained for a week and he was sore. Okay, but you're better. Right? So he's pretty interesting. He can't take a lot of blood, he gets nervous and things. Did I tell you the story about lice? My sister had lice, and my mom and I were taking them out of her hair. She had really long, beautiful hair like Lisa's hair, and we were taking them out. My brother came in and said, what are y'all doing? And I knew what was going to happen, and I showed him like 4 lice in my hand, and he like looked at me, fainted, and then he moved out for 6 months because he was not going to live in a house that had lice. Right? So I tease him about that every once in a while. Coming to piojos lately? Okay, so bombs, chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, they are anti-malarial drugs, and there were people who said that the anti-malarial drugs were effective against COVID. And so there were some clinical trials that started in the US and in Brazil, and the one in Brazil, they had people dying from the actual drugs, and so they stopped the clinical trial. And so then we stopped because we don't want to put anybody in danger. So I'm going to say it didn't work. And then the ivermectin is a anti-exoparasite drug that we put on cattle and we put on horses and goats and things like that, and it doesn't allow the biting flies and the ticks and things like that to be attracted to them, so then they don't have all these parasites on them. There are parasites for like turkeys and things like that. There's a turkey louse, right? And so one of my nieces, she loved ponies, horses. And so a bunch of family members got together, we put a bunch of money together, and we bought her a pony. Well, my cousin who picked the pony out for her did not check the pony for lice. And that pony was completely covered in turkey lice. And then they had pictures of her getting the pony and jumping on it and loving the pony to death. And then just starting to do this, she had turkey lice all over her. So the pony was not the favorite animal anymore after that. Even though I told her, I said, it wasn't the pony's fault, it was your cousin's fault for not checking the pony first. So we are done with COVID. We've got a few more minutes to talk about some of these viruses. We'll end talking with prions. We should be able to finish very easily, and then I'll start unit 4. Okay? So we start with the arboviruses. The arboviruses is a play on words. AR stands for arthropod, BO means born, and virus. So these are viruses that are transmitted by arthropods. And the number one arthropod that does most of the transmission is Provis, what he thinks is the most dangerous organism on the planet, is a mosquito. So here are a bunch of them. Western equine encephalitis, Eastern equine encephalitis, Venezuelan equine encephalitis, which hasn't been in the United States for a while, but is now here again. St. Louis, West Nile, and dengue fever. You need to add Zika to this, right? But all of these things are actually transmitted by the bite of a mosquito. Different mosquitoes, but mosquitoes, right? So if we think about dengue fever, which to me is a very important pathogen, not so much in the United States. However, it is in South Texas, all over the place. It had cases of it in Victoria, right, which is less than 2.5 hours away from here. So it could come up here, right? Dengue fever, when you get it the first time, you might have a very minor case. You feel like you have the flu, but you get better. And then you might get it a second time, and at that time, it could become much more serious. In certain places in the world, dengue fever is known as bone break fever because it's so painful to have. I mean, it can become hemorrhagic, and so there's all kinds of information out there. This is for the city of Karachi, right? And so it's on the Asian continent. It is on the South American continent. It's in Mexico, and it's in the States. So it's something very serious to think about. However, we don't really think about dengue fever too much in Central Texas because we've never had a case of it. But West Nile is the one that we think about most. And that one is transmitted by Culex, like the little mosquito Culex. This is Aedes. Aedes will transmit dengue fever, it will transmit chikungunya, and it will transmit Zika. So Zika is important because it, like other viruses like herpes, can interfere with the uptake of nutrients gestationally, and so therefore, well, look who decided to come on in. So it can really affect the uptake of nutrients during important parts of development gestationally. And in this case, the baby's skull doesn't develop fully, and the baby's brain doesn't develop fully. So they're born, but they're born with what we call microencephaly. Microencephaly just means that you have a malformed skull because the skull isn't formed properly, and therefore the brain itself isn't formed properly. So these individuals are going to need to have care for life. Okay, how many people watch American Horror Story? Anybody watch that? Oh, I can tell you. So Pepper was a microencephalic. Good. So it got a lot of notoriety because it was affecting babies. Right. Now, I am not aware of any true case of a baby being born in the United States that was a microencephalitis due to Zika. But we put a lot of money into it, right? Education and trying to sterilize the male mosquitoes so we wouldn't have a lot of mosquitoes, mostly in Florida. But it was like there was no case, but people got really scared, and so the government of Florida decided to do something to try to alleviate the fear of people. When people don't understand an infectious disease, they just make up things about it, and it seems very scary to a lot of people. Okay? And so that's important to understand that, yeah, a lot of people don't understand what they're really dealing with when they're dealing with infectious agents. And so we need to do a better job of educating people. Some people won't listen. They just won't. Okay? What we do know is if you are going to get married and are thinking about having a child within the next 6 months, you should not go to a tropical paradise for your honeymoon. Because if you pick up Zika, Zika can stay in your body for a while. And the other thing is the males can carry it in their sperm and give it to the female that way. Okay? So again, if your husband or your partner is one that travels to places where Zika is endemic, then you might want to think about holding off on having children until you make sure that he is not a carrier of Zika. Okay? Questions? This is herpes, and I know it's kind of a serious picture for this early in the morning, but there's two types of herpes, simplex 1 and simplex 2. Simplex 1 usually infects the buccal cavity. Simplex 2 usually infects the urogenital area. But I want to tell you that herpes can do a lot of damage. So it can infect the fetus in utero, and then the fetus can be born still. And so or if they're born, they have so many lesions on their little bodies that they don't survive very long.
City of Austin still test.
Thanks a lot, City of Austin.